It was a quiet morning when the phone rang in the small house on the edge of town. The old clock on the wall ticked softly as a mother folded laundry in the living room. She didn't think much of the call at first. It was early, and she assumed it might be her son calling before his classes started. He usually called every few days just to say he was doing fine and to ask if she had eaten properly. That was the kind of boy he was, always caring, always gentle, even though life hadn't been easy for either of them. When she picked up the phone, a man's voice spoke. It was firm, low, and official. He asked if she was the mother of a young man who studied at the city university. She felt her throat tighten as she answered yes. There was a long pause. Then the man said something that made her heart stop. There had been an accident, a serious one. A car had gone off the road late last night. Her son's identification was found at the scene. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. The man continued speaking, but his words blurred together. All she could hear was the pounding of her heartbeat and the echo of her son's laughter in her mind. She asked if he was alive, but there was silence for a few seconds too long. The man finally said they were sorry. Her son had not survived. The phone slipped from her hand. She stood frozen, staring at the floor, her lips trembling as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Her neighbor, hearing the noise, rushed in and found her still holding the dead phone, her face pale as chalk. She couldn't even cry at first. The shock had numbed her completely. That day passed like a fog. Relatives began arriving, bringing food, words of comfort, and tissues. People whispered softly around her, speaking about how unfair life was, how kind her son had been, how no mother should have to go through this. But she didn't hear much. She sat in her chair, staring out the window at the road he used to walk every morning when he came home from college for holidays. Her mind refused to believe it. Just 2 nights ago, she had spoken to him. He sounded tired but cheerful. He said, "Mom, I'll be home soon. There's something I need to talk to you about." And then, suddenly, he was gone. The police told her that the car had burned badly after the crash, so the coffin had to be sealed. They said it was better that she didn't see what was inside. She nodded quietly, not arguing, though something deep inside her stirred uneasily. A mother's heart can feel things that reason cannot explain. But she told herself maybe it was just denial, the pain not ready to accept the truth. The next few days went by in slow motion. The house filled with relatives, neighbors, and sympathy cards. Every corner of the house reminded her of him. The chair he used to sit in, the cup he left on the kitchen shelf, the jacket still hanging by the door. At night, she couldn't sleep. She would sit by his picture and whisper prayers, asking God to give her strength. Sometimes she thought she heard his voice calling from the next room. Sometimes she even got up to check. When the coffin arrived, she stood still for a long moment before approaching it. It was dark and heavy, placed carefully in the center of her small living room. Her legs felt weak and she had to hold onto the table for balance. The sight of it made everything feel more real. Her son, the boy she had raised alone after her husband passed away years ago, was now in there, gone forever. People started visiting again, bringing flowers and lighting candles. Some cried openly, while others just stood silently with their heads bowed. The air felt heavy with grief. Yet in the middle of all this, the mother's heart still carried a strange restlessness. She couldn't understand why, but something about the story didn't sit right with her. Her son's body had been found with his ID, yes, but had anyone actually seen his face? Had anyone confirmed it was him for sure? The police officer who came with the report had been polite but distant. When she asked if anyone at the scene knew him personally, the answer had been no. That night, she sat alone beside the coffin after everyone had gone home. The candles flickered softly. Her fingers traced the wood gently as tears rolled down her cheeks. She whispered his name again and again, like she had done when he was a little boy afraid of the dark. Then for a brief second, she felt something deep inside, an ache that wasn't just grief. It was doubt. It was as if her heart was whispering, "Something's wrong." She remembered their last call again. His voice had been calm, but his words had meaning she hadn't noticed before. He had said, "Mom, if anything happens, promise me you'll always believe me." At the time, she laughed and told him not to say strange things. Now those words felt like a message she hadn't understood. She closed her eyes, feeling her chest tighten. Maybe it was her mind playing tricks. Maybe it was grief twisting her memories. But that feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, before anyone woke up, she went to the police station with her brother. The officer on duty looked surprised to see her. She asked again about the crash, where it happened, who saw it, and whether any items besides the ID were recovered. The man hesitated. Then he showed her a short report. It said the car had gone off the road into a ditch and burned completely. There were 2 people in it. One body was too damaged to recognize. The other was beyond recovery. Her son's documents were found nearby, and based on that, they had identified him. Her eyes widened. "Documents?" she asked. "You didn't check fingerprints?" The officer avoided her gaze. He mumbled something about limited time and the condition of the remains. Her brother put his hand on her shoulder, telling her to let it go, but she couldn't. The doubt in her heart grew louder. She left the station feeling more unsettled than before. The wind blew softly as she walked home, her eyes filled with tears but her mind sharper than ever. If there were 2 people in that car, who was the other one? And why did they assume her son was one of them just because of some documents? He was a careful driver. He never drove late at night. Something was off. When she returned home, people were already preparing for the funeral. The coffin was to be taken to the church the next morning. She sat quietly among the murmuring voices, lost in thought. Her heart was heavy but also restless, as if something was calling her to act before it was too late. She didn't want to disrespect the process, but deep down, she felt she had to know. She had to see her son one last time, no matter what anyone said. As the evening sun dipped behind the hills, she walked toward the coffin again. She placed her hand on it and whispered softly, "If you're really in there, I need to see you. If you're not, please give me a sign." Her voice trembled as she spoke. For a moment, the house was silent. Only the ticking of the old clock filled the room. Later that night, her cousin came over and told her gently that she shouldn't open the coffin. He said it was sealed for a reason and that seeing what was inside would only bring her more pain. She nodded quietly but said nothing. Deep inside, she had already made up her mind. She wasn't doing it out of curiosity, she was doing it out of love. She couldn't say goodbye until she was certain. The next morning, the house was full again. The sound of prayers, crying, and soft hymns filled the air. Everyone was ready to take the coffin to the church. The mother dressed in black and sat near it silently. People came to her offering words of comfort. She thanked them with faint smiles, but her eyes stayed fixed on the wooden box that held her world. She felt weak, yet something inside her was giving her strength. When her closest friend leaned in and asked if she was ready, she whispered, "Not yet." Her voice was calm but firm. Everyone looked at her, puzzled. She stood up slowly, wiped her tears, and looked around the room. "Before I let him go," she said quietly, "I need to see him. I carried him in my body. I raised him with my own hands. I have to see him one last time." The room fell silent. Some people gasped softly. Others tried to stop her, telling her that it wasn't right, that it would only hurt her more. But she didn't move. Her eyes were steady. Her heart, though trembling, was certain. The priest who had come for the prayers looked at her gently and said, "Are you sure?" She nodded, and with that the tension in the room grew heavy. Everyone could feel something coming, something that would change everything. As she placed her trembling hands on the edge of the coffin, her heart pounded so loudly she could barely breathe. Every second felt longer than a minute. She looked up at the crowd of faces watching her and whispered softly, "If what I feel is wrong, I will close it again. But if it's right..." Her voice broke before she could finish. Her brother moved closer, trying to stop her, but she shook her head. The sound of the metal seal being loosened filled the room. The lid began to lift and every eye was fixed on her. In that single moment before the truth revealed itself, the mother's heart was full of fear and hope, pain and courage, all mixed together. She prayed silently for strength, unaware that what she was about to see would leave everyone speechless. The lid lifted slowly, and the room grew so silent that even breathing felt loud. The mother's hands trembled as she peered inside, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. People leaned closer, expecting to see what no one wanted to imagine. But the moment her eyes fell on the face inside, her whole body froze. The man lying in that coffin looked similar, but not the same. His features were close, but something was off. The nose was slightly different, the jawline sharper. Her mind tried to convince her it was just the damage from the accident. But when she looked down at the hands, her breath caught in her throat. Her son had a small scar on his right hand, a tiny mark from when he had fallen off his bicycle as a boy. She remembered that scar vividly, She had cleaned the wound herself and wrapped it with a bandage, comforting him while he cried. But the man in the coffin had no scar. The hand was smooth. She blinked hard, thinking maybe she was mistaken, maybe the light was playing tricks. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. That hand didn't belong to her son. Gasps filled the room as she whispered in a shaking voice, "This isn't my boy." People around her stared, unsure what to do. Her brother tried to calm her, saying maybe the scar had faded over time, but she shook her head. "I know my son," she said, tears running down her face. "A mother knows." The priest gently asked her to sit down, worried she might faint. But she stood firm, her eyes locked on the body inside the coffin. The pendant that her son always wore, the one she gave him on his 18th birthday, was missing too. He never went anywhere without it. She had asked him about it many times, and he always said, "It's my lucky charm." The man in the coffin didn't have it around his neck. Whispers spread quickly among the guests. Some said grief had made her lose her mind. Others said maybe there had been a mix-up. But one thing was clear. Everyone could see the doubt in her eyes. It wasn't madness, it was something deeper. After the service ended, the mother refused to allow the burial. She asked the authorities to come immediately. People tried to persuade her, telling her it was time to let go, that her heart was only clinging to false hope. But she stood her ground. "If I bury this body," she said quietly, "and later find out my son was alive, I could never forgive myself." Her words silenced everyone. The police arrived later that day. The officer who came looked uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for what awaited him. He listened as the mother explained everything, the missing scar, the missing pendant, the differences in the face. At first he tried to reassure her that such changes were normal after severe accidents, but when he looked closely, even he began to hesitate. She demanded a fingerprint test. The officer hesitated, saying it might take time and paperwork. She didn't care. She insisted. Her voice, though shaking, carried a force that left no room for refusal. That night the coffin was moved to a secure location until the tests could be done. The house was quiet once again, but the mother couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the dark road outside. The stars were hidden behind clouds. She remembered the nights when her son used to call her from college, talking about his studies, his friends, and his plans for the future. He always said he wanted to make her proud. Now all she wanted was the truth. Her brother came to her later, trying to comfort her. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've been through enough." But she shook her head. "I can't," she replied. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." He sighed and sat beside her. "Even if it's not him," he said carefully, "what if you're just holding on to hope that will break you later?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "Hope doesn't break me," she said. "Lies do." The next day she went back to the police station, carrying a small photo of her son and a copy of his birth documents. She handed them to the officer and asked him to make sure the prints were tested carefully. The officer nodded and promised to do it. But as she was about to leave, she noticed something. On the report file, there was a second name written faintly in the corner. Another man had been involved in the same crash. "Who was that?" she asked. The officer looked uneasy. "Another victim," he said. "We couldn't identify him. He didn't have any ID on him." Her heart raced. 2 men in the same car, one identified only by her son's documents. One unidentified. Could it be possible her son wasn't in that car at all? She pressed further, asking where the crash happened and if there were witnesses. The officer sighed. It was late at night. Nobody saw it happen. A farmer found the wreck in the morning. The mother's mind spun with questions. Why was her son's ID in that car? Why would he be driving that late? Why did the second man have no identity? The unease inside her grew stronger with every passing hour. When she returned home, people were already gossiping. Some said she was in denial. Others whispered that she was making a scene. But she didn't care about any of it. She only cared about the truth. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her son's last message on her phone. It said, "Mom, I'll call you tomorrow. I have something to tell you." She wondered what he wanted to tell her. What was he working on? Why did he sound worried? The questions circled in her head like restless birds. That evening, the officer called her. He said the initial results would be available the next day. She barely slept that night, waiting for the sun to rise. Every minute felt longer than an hour. When morning finally came, she was already dressed and ready. At the police station, the officer's face told her everything before he spoke. He looked nervous. "There's been a mistake," he said finally. "The fingerprints don't match. The body in the coffin isn't your son." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The room spun around her. She had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was real, she couldn't breathe. She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks, not just from relief but from shock. "Then where is he?" she whispered. The officer looked down. "We don't know," he said quietly. "But we'll find out." Her brother, who had come with her, wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She couldn't speak. Her heart was beating fast, filled with both hope and fear. Her son was alive somewhere, but where? And why had someone else been found with his documents? The police began reinvestigating the case. They checked nearby hospitals, contacted city patrols, and even looked into surveillance footage from the area. The mother waited anxiously every day, visiting the station, calling anyone who might have seen him. Some days she sat by the window for hours, imagining him walking down the road smiling, saying, "Mom, I'm home." But days turned into weeks and still no news came. People in the neighborhood started whispering again, saying maybe it was better not to know, that he might be gone after all, but she refused to believe it. Every morning she prayed, lighting a candle for him, speaking softly as if he could hear her. One evening, just as she was preparing dinner, the phone rang again. Her heart jumped. The voice on the other end was different this time. It was from another town's hospital. The nurse asked her name and then paused. "We think we might have your son here," she said. The mother nearly dropped the phone. She demanded to know where, how, and what happened. The nurse explained that a young man had been brought in a few days ago. He had been found unconscious by the roadside after being attacked and left for dead. He had no ID with him, but his description matched the one she had given to the police. Her hands shook as she tried to write down the address. The moment she hung up, she ran to her brother's room, shouting the news through tears. He stared at her, speechless, and then quickly got the car keys. They drove through the night, the rain pouring down heavily on the windshield. She kept whispering prayers the entire way, her hands clutched tightly together. When they reached the hospital, she rushed inside. The nurse led her down a quiet hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her heart pounded louder than the sound of her shoes against the floor. Finally, the nurse opened a door. Inside on the bed lay a young man with a bandage around his head. His face was bruised, pale, and tired, but alive. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she walked closer. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched his hand. It was warm. His eyes fluttered open weakly. For a moment, he looked confused. Then his lips moved, and in a faint whisper, he said, "Mom?" The mother broke down, crying harder than she ever had before. She fell to her knees beside him, holding his hand tightly as if she would never let go again. The nurse stepped out quietly. Giving them space, outside the sun began to rise, its first light shining through the window. The nightmare was finally ending, but the truth, how all of this had happened, was still waiting to be uncovered, and deep inside, the mother knew that this story wasn't over yet. The moment her son opened his eyes and whispered, "Mom," everything around her disappeared. The walls, the lights, the people, it all faded away. All she could see was his face, weak but alive. She had waited for this moment for what felt like forever, and now that it was here, her heart could hardly believe it. She fell beside his bed, holding his hand against her cheek. Tears ran freely down her face. "You're alive," she whispered again and again, as if saying it could make it more real. Her son looked at her, his eyes watery, his lips trembling as if trying to speak. But his voice was too soft to hear. The nurse came closer and said gently, "He needs rest. He's still weak. He's been through a lot." The mother nodded, still unable to take her eyes off him. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but for now she only wanted to stay there beside him, listening to the faint sound of his breathing. Hours passed. She didn't sleep, didn't move. Every few minutes she'd check to see if he was still breathing. It felt like a miracle she was afraid to lose. Her brother sat outside the room, quietly thanking God for bringing him back. When morning came, the doctor came in to check on him. "He's lucky," the doctor said softly. "He had a head injury and several bruises. Whoever attacked him left him for dead. But he's strong. He'll recover." The mother listened carefully. "Attacked?" she repeated, her voice breaking slightly. The doctor nodded. "Yes, it seems like a robbery. We found marks on his arms that show he was dragged. He was unconscious for almost 3 days before someone found him. She felt her stomach twist. Her son was alive, but what had he gone through? And who had hurt him? Later that day, when he finally had the strength to speak, she sat beside him, holding his hand gently. His voice was rough and quiet. "I knew you'd find me," he said, looking at her weakly. "I knew you wouldn't believe it." She smiled through her tears. "A mother knows," she whispered. "I never believed you were gone." He tried to smile, but pain crossed his face. "I don't remember everything," he said slowly. "It was late that night. I was driving back home. Someone waved me down on the side of the road like they needed help. When I stopped, 2 men came out of nowhere. They pulled me out of the car, hit me, and took my wallet and bag. I tried to fight, but one of them pushed me down. After that, everything went dark." Her heart ached as she listened. "Did you see their faces?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Just shadows," he murmured. I think they took my car." She remembered what the police had said, that his car was found at the crash site, burned with 2 people inside. Could it be that those men were the ones who died in the accident? She didn't tell him yet. She didn't want to shock him while he was still weak. She only nodded gently, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered. "That's all that matters." But her mind was already racing. If what he said was true, then everything that had happened, the wrong body, the sealed coffin, the false report, had all been a chain of terrible mistakes. The next day, she went to the police station again. When the officer saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief. "You were right," he said quietly. "Your son is alive." She nodded but didn't smile. "And the 2 men in the crash?" she asked. He opened the file on his desk. "They were both unidentified," he said. "We found no documents on them, just your son's papers in the car. It looks like they used his car and his ID." Her heart sank. "So they stole everything from him," she murmured. The officer nodded. Yes, they probably didn't expect a crash. They were driving too fast. It was raining heavily that night. It seems the car lost control. The mother sighed, feeling both sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the lives lost, but relief that her son had survived. When she returned to the hospital, her son was awake, sitting up with the help of a nurse. He looked better, though still weak. She sat beside him again, and this time, she told him everything. The mistaken identity, the funeral, the coffin, and the moment she opened it. He listened in silence, his eyes filling with tears. "You went through all that," he said softly. "Because of me." She shook her head quickly. "No, because of love," she said firmly. "Because something in my heart wouldn't let me believe it. I just knew." He reached for her hand, squeezing it weakly. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said. She smiled faintly, her eyes still wet. "You don't have to know. You just have to live." For the next few days, she stayed at the hospital, helping him eat, helping him walk again. Each step he took felt like a victory. The nurses admired her strength, whispering to each other about how powerful a mother's love could be. When he was finally strong enough to go home, the hospital staff came to say goodbye. Even the doctor smiled and said, "You're lucky to have such a mother." The ride home was quiet. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in soft orange light. The mother looked out the window, her hand resting over her son's. Every few minutes she'd glance at him as if making sure he was really there. He caught her looking and smiled. "I'm not going anywhere," he said gently. She laughed softly, wiping away a tear. "I know. I just can't believe it's real." When they reached home, the neighbors gathered outside, their faces filled with shock and joy. News had already spread that he was alive. People came forward, hugging them, crying, thanking God. The same house that had been full of mourning days ago was now filled with laughter and relief. That night, after everyone left, the mother sat with her son in the living room. The candlelight flickered softly. He looked at her and said, "Mom, when I was lying there on the road, I thought it was over. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. But I remember thinking about you. I remember thinking, she'll know. She'll come for me." Her eyes filled with tears again. "I did," she said softly. "I just followed my heart." He leaned back, his eyes heavy but peaceful. "You saved me," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Love did." But even as she said it, a thought lingered quietly in her mind. How could the police have been so careless? How could they have mistaken someone else for her son without checking properly? She felt grateful but also unsettled. She wanted to know how everything went so wrong. The next morning, she went back to the station once more. The officer explained that because the car was burned and the identification papers were found nearby, they assumed the victim was her son. It was a simple mistake, he said, but the mother couldn't help but feel it was more than that. If she hadn't opened that coffin, her son would have been buried as someone else. That thought haunted her. As she walked back home, she looked up at the sky and whispered a quiet prayer, not just of thanks, but of promise. She promised never to doubt her instincts again. When she entered the house, her son was sitting by the window looking outside. He turned to her and smiled. "It feels strange," he said softly. "Everyone thought I was gone." She walked over and sat beside him. "That's because life sometimes gives us second chances," she said gently. "And we must never waste them." He nodded, thinking quietly. Then he asked, "Mom, when you saw the coffin, weren't you scared?" She looked down, her hands folded in her lap. "Terrified," she admitted. "But love is stronger than fear. I couldn't let them bury you without seeing your face. Something told me it wasn't you, and when I saw those hands without your scar, I knew." He smiled faintly. "That little scar," he said, shaking his head. "I never thought it would save my life." She laughed softly. "It didn't save your life," she said. "It saved my heart." The room grew quiet again. Outside, the night was calm. The sound of crickets filled the air. She stood up, closed the window, and looked at her son once more. He was safe, home, alive. That was all that mattered. Still, in the back of her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about the other two men, the ones who had attacked him and taken his car. Their deaths were tragic, but they had also left behind a mystery. Who were they? Why had they targeted her son? Those questions would soon lead her to answers she never expected. Answers that would reveal just how deep fate's hand had reached into their lives. But for now, she sat beside him quietly, resting her head on his shoulder, grateful for the warmth of his presence and the miracle of his return. She stood frozen in the middle of the church, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it echo inside her chest. The coffin was open, and the truth lay in front of everyone. That wasn't her son inside. The air turned heavy and silent, as if the world had stopped for a moment. People looked at her with shock and confusion, some whispering that maybe grief had made her lose her senses. But deep down she knew what her eyes were seeing. A mother never forgets her child's face. Her legs felt weak and she almost fell to the floor, but someone caught her by the arm. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is not my son," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. The priest and the few men standing near the coffin looked at one another. One of them said gently, "Ma'am, maybe the accident changed how he looks. It's been days. You should rest." But she shook her head, clutching the small locket around her neck, the same one her son had given her on his last birthday. "He has a small scar on his hand," she said, her voice growing louder now. "It happened when he was little." "I don't see it here." She lifted the stranger's hand with trembling fingers. The scar was not there. "And his pendant," she said, pointing to the neck. "He never took it off." There was nothing there either. A low murmur spread through the crowd. People started to believe her. The police officer, who had been standing quietly at the back, stepped forward. He looked uncertain, wiping the sweat from his forehead. We were told the identification was based on documents found near the body," he explained. "The car was burned badly and it was difficult to recognize anything." The mother turned toward him with eyes full of fire and pain. "So you never confirmed it? You just sent this poor boy to me and said he was my son?" Her voice broke halfway through, but she didn't stop. The officer tried to calm her down, telling her it must have been an honest mistake, but she wasn't listening anymore. Her whole body shook as she stared at the stranger lying in the coffin. Someone else's child, not hers. The room was in chaos now. People began leaving, whispering in shock. The mother's friends surrounded her, trying to comfort her, but she pushed their hands away. "I told everyone something was wrong," she said through her tears. "I could feel it in my heart. My son is not gone. He's alive somewhere. I know it." That night she sat in her dark living room with the lights off. The half-burnt candle on the table flickered softly, and her son's picture stared back at her from the wall. She hadn't eaten all day, but she didn't feel hunger. All she could think about were the missing details. The scar, the pendant, the wrong face. Every part of her wanted answers. She went to the police station early the next morning. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. She demanded to speak to the officer in charge of the case. The officer hesitated, but finally brought her into a small office filled with files and papers. "Please," she said quietly, "tell me everything about that night. Where exactly did the accident happen? Who saw it first? And where's the car now?" The officer opened a folder and flipped through some documents. "The car was found on the edge of a small highway outside the city," he said. "There was another vehicle involved, a truck that had been parked nearby. The man driving that truck said he saw the crash from a distance. When he reached the site, the car was already burning. Did anyone see my son before the crash?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, we only found his wallet and his college ID. The body was taken to the morgue and identified through those." The mother's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "What about fingerprints? Did anyone check those?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "No, ma'am. It wasn't considered necessary since we had the documents." Her voice rose suddenly. "Not necessary? You nearly buried the wrong person because of a wallet." The officer lowered his eyes, ashamed. "We'll reopen the case," he said softly. "We'll do the fingerprint test." 2 days later, she received a call. The results had come in. Her heart raced as she held the phone to her ear. The officer's voice was calm but serious. "Ma'am, we checked the fingerprints. You were right. The person in that coffin is not your son." The phone almost slipped from her hand. She sat down on the floor, her knees giving way. For a moment she couldn't speak. Tears rolled down her face, but this time, they weren't only from pain, they were from hope. Her son was alive somewhere. The thought made her chest tighten with both relief and fear. The police started digging deeper. They found out that her son's ID and wallet had been reported missing by him 2 days before the accident. It turned out he had been robbed in the same city where the crash happened. Someone had stolen his belongings and perhaps used his car. The pieces slowly began to connect. The man in the coffin was the real thief, the one who stole her son's identity and met a tragic end in the crash. But the question now was, where was her son? A few days passed with no news. The mother couldn't sleep at night. She walked around the house holding his photograph, whispering prayers that he would come back. Her heart refused to give up. She spent her mornings visiting hospitals, showing his picture to nurses and doctors, asking if anyone had seen him. Each time they shook their heads, her hope wavered a little, but she still refused to stop. Then one morning the phone rang again. It was the same officer. His voice sounded different this time, urgent but calm. "Ma'am," he said, "we might have found him." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "There's a young man at a hospital in a nearby town. He's been unconscious for days. No one knows who he is. The nurses said he was found by a roadside, badly hurt. He matches your son's description." The mother dropped the phone and ran out of the house. She didn't care that she hadn't eaten, slept, or even changed her clothes properly. She just needed to get there. The road felt endless, every minute stretching like an hour. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. When she reached the hospital, her hands were trembling so much she could barely sign the visitor book. The nurse led her down a long corridor that smelled of medicine and disinfectant. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they finally reached the room, the nurse stopped and looked at her kindly. "He's inside," she said softly. The mother took a deep breath, her eyes already filled with tears. She slowly pushed the door open. The sight before her made her gasp. A young man lay on the bed, bandaged and pale, but breathing. His face was bruised, yet somehow familiar. She stepped closer, her heart ready to burst. Her trembling hand reached out and touched his fingers. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly his eyelids fluttered open. His eyes met hers, weak but clear. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The world stopped. Her knees buckled and she sat beside his bed, crying uncontrollably. She held his hand tightly as if afraid he would disappear again. "I knew it," she sobbed. "I knew you were alive. I told them you weren't gone." He smiled faintly, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I tried to call you," he said weakly. "They took everything from me. I didn't know where I was." She hugged him gently, careful not to hurt his injuries. "It doesn't matter now," she said softly. "You're here. That's all that matters." Outside the room, the nurse quietly closed the door, her own eyes glistening with tears. Word spread through the hospital. The boy thought dead had been found alive, all because his mother refused to give up. The mother sat by his bedside the whole night, holding his hand. Every once in a while she would glance at his face, still unable to believe he was truly there. The moonlight fell softly through the window, touching both their faces. For the first time in many nights she felt peace. She whispered quietly, almost to herself, "A mother's heart never lies." The mother stayed at the hospital for days, hardly leaving her son's side. Every time he opened his eyes, she felt like she was waking up from a terrible dream. She would touch his face, still not believing that he was really there, alive and breathing. The doctor said he was lucky to survive. His body had bruises and cuts, but his spirit was strong. He had been through something terrible, but he was fighting his way back. She spent her days sitting beside his bed, feeding him soup, changing the wet towel on his forehead, and whispering prayers of thanks. Sometimes he would drift into sleep, and she would just sit quietly, watching his chest rise and fall. That small movement was enough to fill her heart with peace. When he was strong enough to talk, the police visited the hospital to hear what had really happened. The mother stayed close, holding his hand as he spoke softly, his voice still weak. He told them that on the night of the accident, he had been walking home from work when two strangers stopped him on the road. They asked him for directions at first, and he didn't think much of it. But then one of them suddenly grabbed him, demanding his wallet and car keys. He said they pushed him to the ground and hit him when he tried to fight back. After that, everything became blurry. He remembered them taking his things and driving off in his car. He lay there for hours before someone finally found him and brought him to the hospital. He had no ID, no phone, and no way to contact anyone. When he woke up after days of unconsciousness, he didn't even know what city he was in. The mother listened quietly, her eyes filling with tears again. She couldn't believe how close she had come to losing him forever. The police nodded, taking notes. They told her that one of the men who stole his car had died in the crash. The fire had burned everything so badly that they assumed it was her son because of the wallet and papers inside. It had all been a tragic mistake. When the police left, the mother sat beside him, her hands gently brushing his hair away from his face. "You see," she whispered. "I told them you weren't gone." I could feel it. Her son gave a weak smile. "You always said a mother knows everything." She laughed softly through her tears. "And I was right again, wasn't I?" The days passed, and he began to recover faster. The color slowly returned to his face, and his smile grew stronger. The doctor said he would soon be able to go home. When they finally discharged him, the whole hospital staff gathered near the entrance. Many had followed his story after hearing what had happened, how a mother's love had brought her son back from a grave he never belonged to. Some nurses even cried as they said goodbye. The drive home was long but peaceful. The mother kept looking at him in the passenger seat, afraid he might disappear if she blinked. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in weeks, her heart felt light. When they reached home, the neighbors were waiting outside. Someone had spread the news that he was alive. People came running, shouting, crying, hugging them both. The same house that had been silent with grief was now full of laughter and tears of joy. Her son looked around, smiling shyly as everyone touched his shoulder and asked how he was. "I don't remember much," he said softly, "but I remember one thing very clearly. I knew my mom would never stop looking for me." That night, after everyone left, the two of them sat on the porch under the quiet sky. The street was calm, the air smelled of rain, and the stars were slowly appearing above them. The mother leaned her head against his shoulder. "You scared me more than anything in this world," she said with a small smile. "I'm sorry," he replied. "I never thought this would happen. I just wanted to come home that night."